Good afternoon, everybody. It's really a pleasure really welcoming you in this session dedicated to greenhouse gases and climate mitigation. We will do it through the lenses of the EDGAR database, which is the emission database for global atmospheric research. And then the EDGAR database is used for many different purposes. It is compiled at the global scale, and then it is used for the scientific applications as well as support for policymakers. And I also remind all of you that all the data of EDGAR are freely available. EDGAR has been used also in recent international assessment and important reports like the IPCC, as well as the UNEP emission gap report that you have heard also through these days. We are going to spend this time together in two different sessions. The first one that I will chair, where we are going to have two contributions, two presentations. The first done by our colleague Monica Kripa, introducing the database, but also showing the recent results of our work. And the second by Simone Rossi, focusing the attention to one of the most important components, which is and one of the most recent, which is the LULUCF component. The second part will be chaired by Giacomo Grassi, and we'll see panel discussions on these themes. Before leaving the floor to our first speaker, I remind you that you have the possibility to fill in your questions so that we can openly ask them to our panelists and our speakers. And you will see there the QR code where you can enter our site for the questions. Without a further delay, I will give you the floor to Monica. She will start the first presentation. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for the introduction. Good afternoon also from my side. Okay. Okay, this is a joint work developed by the European Commission as well as the European the International Energy Agency and the environmental agencies in the Netherlands. In this presentation, I will show a couple of developments within the EDGAR database, which is the emissions database for global atmospheric research, which provides greenhouse gas and air pollutant emissions from 1970 till nowadays for all countries, all emitting sectors, and it provides an independent view of greenhouse gas emissions compared to what is officially reported under the United Nations Framework Convention on climate change by the parties. The EDGAR data are used, therefore, to enhance the transparency framework as requested by the Paris Agreement for the official reporting while providing independent estimates, but they also contribute to the preparation of the global carbon stocktake set by the Paris Agreement while completing the global picture of officially reported data. And so we will see in this presentation some of the key developments of EDGAR for climate mitigation policy support. Next slide, please. Let's have a look at the latest EDGAR data. So since 1970, global greenhouse gas have been increasing despite the common and international effort in reducing them. So despite all the national efforts, the international agreements, in 2021, global greenhouse gas emissions have been increased by 4.3% compared to the previous year, which actually was a local minimum due to the COVID pandemic. Time series of greenhouse gas emissions reflect the socioeconomic patterns and evolutions at regional but also global level, changes in the economy, in the markets of emerging economies. And 2/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions are associated with CO2, while minor contributions, but still relevant, are associated with methane, N2O, and fluorinated gases. An interesting feature, which is reported here in green, is represented by the land use change and forestry removals and sources, which actually represent an interesting mitigation option when dealing with global climate change mitigation. And this topic will be fully addressed by our colleague Simone Rossi in the next presentation. So from here on, we will focus on fossil CO2 or fossil greenhouse gas emissions as developed by the EDGAR database. Next slide, please. Let's have a look at where do we stand now. This map shows for each country a comparison of today's emissions versus the 1990 levels, which is the base year for emission reporting. And in green, we have countries whose emissions have been decreasing over the past 3 decades, while in yellow, orange, and red, we represent countries whose emissions are still increasing nowadays. And having a look at Europe, overall, the European Union has achieved the 2020 emission reduction targets. However, there are still country-specific differences. Next slide. In 2021, 63% of global greenhouse gas emissions is produced by 6 economies. And in particular, they were China, representing 1/3 of global greenhouse gas. Then we have the US, India, the European Union, Russia, and Brazil. And these 6 economies represent 50% of the global population and around 60% of global gross domestic product. Next slide. In order to understand how can we mitigate greenhouse gas emissions at the global and regional and national level, it's important to understand which are the emission sources. At the global level, 70% of greenhouse gas emissions in 2021 is associated with combustion-related sources, in particular arising from power generation, industrial activities, transportation, and residential. And this figure is further enhanced when looking, for example, at emerging economies such as China, where 80% of its emissions is associated with combustion-related processes, and in particular with a high share of energy and industry activities. Even in Europe, the majority of greenhouse gas emissions is arising from combustion sources. However, the subsector shares is different. We see an important role of transportation and residential. But even in Europe, around 10% of greenhouse gas emissions is associated with agricultural activities. And this figure is more prominent even in other world regions, such as Latin America or African countries, where agriculture and non-combustion related sources, such as waste and fuel exploitation, represent more than half of their greenhouse gas emissions. And so it's very important to address not only decarbonization pathways or energy efficiency strategies, but also look at non-combustion related sectors as well. Next slide, please.
Monica, 1 minute left.
Okay, so one of the latest developments of EDGAR is represented by EDGAR Food, which allowed us to move from a source-based approach to a system approach in order to tackle in a more integrated way global greenhouse gas emission mitigation. Next slide. And one of the latest developments is also represented by the agricultural emission estimation tool, which allows member states and inventory compilers to prepare their emissions for official reporting under the UNFCCC as well as under the National Emission Reduction Commitment Directive for the air pollutants in a consistent way in order to support the development of coherent policies. And now I hand over the floor to Simone Rossi, who will introduce the latest EDGAR development on land use change and forestry emissions. Thanks.
Thank you, Monica.
Hello, good morning, everybody. I will introduce you the LULUCF component of this data set of the EDGAR database. Monica before showed the pathway, let's see, that we have to follow to arrive to this point. And this slide shows basically the pathway that we have to follow to arrive to climate neutrality. And in particular, we see on the below the zero, the contribution that the land use change and forestry sector can do. We are, of course, in this case, in the area of the sink, of the removals. So basically the contribution of the sector, the LULUCF sector is a net sink, so it can help in removing the CO2 from the atmosphere. We can, and its importance will be, its relative importance will be growing in the next years, since the total emissions will decrease. Next slide, please. The goal of this component, of this other development of this component, is to develop a new globally consistent component with global referenced emissions estimation for the land use sector. We chose to follow the IPCC T1 approach, which is the most the basic, let's say, approach suggested by the IPCC, in order to make use of the data globally available and to have a unique approach at global level. Next slide, please. The activity data that we are using, the activity data in the LULUCF sector, in this case, are for the gain part, so for the removals from the atmosphere, the ESA CCI, Climate Change Initiative, Copernicus, satellite-derived land cover, and for the losses part, so the emissions in the atmosphere, the FAUSTAT harvest data. The selection of the parameter the parameters are selected from the 2006 IPCC guidelines, updated in any case when we could with the new 2019 refinement, and this required a massive expert judgment. Now, I think that this was not exactly my presentation, it's a previous version, but we can go on in any case. The parameters are assigned to each grid cell through ancillary data based on that can help in allocating to each pixel, let's say, the correct data, the correct parameter that we have to use. We can move to the next slide. So the component at the moment within the data set are these data that I'm presenting now, that are the vegetation living biomass contribution from the forest land areas. Then there are the emissions from the biomass burning sector that were produced by the Global Wildfire Information System. And then we plan to include, we included also the CO2 fluxes from other categories from the official greenhouse gas reporting to the UNFCCC, from a data set we developed with all the available data to the sent to the UNFCCC. We can move to the next slide. Okay, this is the article that describes this data set with all the available data. We can move to the next slide. The data selection, as I said, for the land use part, we are talking about this Copernicus Climate Change Initiative, Climate Change Service data set at 300 meters from 92 to the present day. Then climate data, ecological zones from the FAO, global ecological zones, an impact forest layer, which is used to identify unmanaged forest land, and then other ancillary data set. For the statistical data, we're using FAO-Stat and the forest resource assessment from the FAO. We can move to the next slide. So at the moment we have in our data set essentially a land use area data set, which basically shows all the area of the different type of forest that we can identify from the Copernicus land cover product. The gains divided by broadleaf, needleleaf, age classes, and the system, let's say the system, so planted or naturally growing, and the losses from fuel wood, industrial roundwood, and also in this case from broadleaf and needleleaf. We can move to the next slide. This is just an image showing the final results that we obtain. What I want to draw your attention to is that the fact that we are able to cover areas for which very often we do not have official estimates available. So we are really filling a gap also in terms of the data availability, especially in some areas, like in this case, in the African forest. We can move to the next slide. Okay, this is another image from the European area, from the losses. Next slide, please. Okay, this is the global CO2 emissions and removals from the LULUCF sector. We are around, in terms of the total biomass, around minus a removal of 8/9 gigatons of CO2, while for the total LULUCF sector, we are around 4 gigatons per year of CO2. This is quite in line with what is described by other data set, and we obtain a total removal higher than what is at the moment declared by the countries. But as I said, we are also covering a wider area, and we have also to carefully select the parameters to describe at best the situation in the different parts of the world. I think we can move to the next slide.
Simone, 1 minute left.
This is actually a slide from the European EU27 situation. This is not really the most recent slide, as I said. This is not go to the previous one, please. We are seeing that there is a decrease in the removal that has already been documented in several ways, and that has surely to be reversed to meet the climate goal of the European Commission. We can move to the next slide. Here I want to show also, thanks to the global wide fire information system, to our colleague that are written below, the group of Jesus San Miguel, the CO2 emissions from forest fires. This is based on MODIS data, and from 2002 onwards is very close to what is reported by member states in their inventories. So we can move to the next slide. I think this is probably the last one. So I thank you very much for your attention, and please wait also for in case of questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Simone. Thank you, Monica. We started to have some questions, but I waited to have a few more. Sorry? I waited to have a few more for putting, but I wanted to make the first one, which is related to one of the aspects, Monica, that you showed quite rapidly at the last of your presentation. One of the EDGAR application, that is the EDGAR food, is based on a system approach rather than looking the single sources. What do you think EDGAR can do in the future with that? I mean, looking at other systems as you did for food, and what is the benefit of such an approach?
Thanks for this very challenging and interesting question. Actually, the EDGAR food work has been a pioneer work in this sense, in investigating global food system emissions from food system emissions from a different perspective. We moved from source-based approach, which is typically the approach requested by climate mitigation policies, so reducing for example, greenhouse gas emissions from a specific sector. However, our studies showed that having an integrated view, looking at all the chain from the production of food till the consumption and end of life allows to get a completely different picture. So changing the perspective in order to understand which are the most effective mitigation options and potential to be implemented from the policy side, but also to address the consumers and end users, for example, for food systems, so the food that we consume towards a more sustainable consumption pattern. This pioneer tool could be further extended, and this is the outcome of this study to other systems in which we are confronted on our daily life, and that could be from the construction system, the textile, but all our economy could be interpreted or revised in a systemic view. And this is one also the messages retrieved in the latest UNEP emission gap report, where in order to achieve effective mitigation actions, it's important to have system-wide transformations.
Thank you, Monica. I will ask you and Simone to be concise in the answer because we have a very few minutes. We have questions, I think, related to Simone, or Simone can answer. Sometimes you hear that planting 1 or sometimes 3 billion of trees will solve our climate change problem. Is it really that easy?
No, in the sense that as you have seen from the graphs, the contribution in removals of the LULUCF in any case can be increased, but it's not able to solve the problem. The first thing to do is to reduce absolutely the fossil emissions and the top part of the figure that we have seen before. So it's surely useful, but cannot be enough to solve the problem.
Thank you, Simone. Another one to you. Which are the main challenges in preparing a global tier 1 data set on LULUCF?
And the LULUCF sector in itself is very complicated. And the main challenges in applying the IPCC-T1 approach is basically in the selection of the parameters, because the tables provided by the IPCC are very differentiated by the areas. So I would say, first of all, the selection of the parameter, and also the limitations that we have also in terms of the data available and the definitions, the changing definition also of the forest compared with what is defined forest by the IPCC and what we can see from the satellites, for example.
So thank you, Simone, Monica. Our time is up. I leave the floor to Giacomo to start the second part of this session, and remind our colleagues there on the screen to post their questions. It will be the case also for the second part. Thank you. Giacomo, to you.
Good afternoon, good morning, everybody. Can you hear me well? Very good. Well, next slide, please. Okay, well, I will start this brief introduction to the second panel with a few slides just to set the scene. The graph on the left shows the historical emission in black from national inventories, and the various emission pathway to the future simulated by models. And of course, as you can see, the more we meet, the higher the global temperature will be. And to make the narrative a bit more lively, let's put the Paris Agreement into a car, inside a car, and imagine 3 elements like shown in the graph in the right: the driver, the car dashboard, and the navigation system. So the driver, in essence, represents the policymaker, that holds the steering wheel and decide the direction and the speed. The car dashboard is somehow the national inventories And like the dashboard provides key information to the driver, so national inventory provides key information to climate policy and for assessing compliance toward the climate target. And finally, the navigation system are somehow the global models, those that outline the future emission pathway. They describe the future emission pathway to reach specific temperature. Like the navigation system describe routes to reach specific destination. And of course, once a destination is kind of selected, then somehow the driver selected the -2 degree here in the context of the Paris Agreement, the driver may use the navigation system to check that they're on track. And the same applies to the global stocktake. Next slide. Next slide, please. Yes. And essentially, the global stocktake every 5 years assesses the collective progress toward the well below 2 degree target in the light of a best available science. The technical phase of the global stocktake was kicked off last June in Bonn and will end with the political phase in December 2023. So essentially, two kind of input data will be analyzed. On the one side, the aggregated country greenhouse gas data, and on the other side, IPCC and scientific data, as shown in the graph. These will be compared for future projections, so climate pledges against what science indicators needed to stay within the Paris Agreement goal, and an emission gap will be somehow estimated. This will then trigger further climate ambition in the subsequent plan NDC, which are expected in 2025. Next. And here, this picture has been taken from the Glasgow conference last year. And from last year to now, I'm now in Sharm-el-Sheikh at the COP. We are witnessing a shift from a focus on pledges to a focus on implementation and tracking. So for the first time after many COPs have been attending, we are seeing that transparency is becoming somehow more sexy. There is an increasing interest in that, especially on land use fluxes, because they are the main tool we have to remove CO2 from the atmosphere, and because they are highly uncertain. Next slide. One of the examples of this uncertainty is a recent study that highlighted a large gap on land use CO2 fluxes between global models used in the IPCC assessment report and countries. This gap attracted a lot of attention also by media and confuses policymakers. So if we have such a large gap, which is greater than emission from the whole USA, can we trust LULUCF data? Can we use model to assess progress? How can we assess progress if you have such a big gap? Next. And here, essentially, this graph shows the main reason of the gap. On the specific box, you have the various components of the global carbon budget. On the left, you have the emissions, fossil fuel and use. On the right, you have where this emission goes. Nearly half remain in the atmosphere, creating global warming, but the more than half are absorbed by ocean or forest. And the problem is on the definition of anthropogenic forest sinks, so human-induced absorption of CO2 by forest. The global models consider only the left part, while country inventory consider also part of the CO2 sink absorbed by forest. Essentially, country consider as anthropogenic part of the forest CO2 sink that models consider natural. This issue has been acknowledged at the highest level, and recent studies show that reconciliation is possible and actually is needed under the global stocktake. Next. And just to conclude, I would conclude with this now well-known aphorism that if you don't measure or you don't trust your measure, you don't manage. I mean, addressing the climate crisis desperately need reliable data. And here, my concluding message is that for the scientific society depicted on the left side, what is the challenge is to provide estimates that are conceptually comparable with country estimates, which use the same system boundaries as represented by the two apples. So the aim for the scientific community is to provide apple-to-apple comparison. The challenge for the country community is depicted by this picture taken here a few days ago in Sharm-el-Sheikh, which represent the beauty of the coral reef. So may the country inventory be so transparent as the seawater here in Sharm, and may their ambition and action be such that the coral reef actually do not bleach. So with this introduction, I would leave the floor to an excellent collection of panelists, including William Lamb. He will speak on the role of, the question for him is elaborate on the role of EDGAR in contributing to the global stocktake. Martin Harold, and again, these are a question just to his intervention. Finally, Vicky Pollard, head of unit in DigiClima, on the relevance of EDGAR for the global climate commitment and in the context of the EU policy. So I would first give a round of short talk to them, and then we'll come back again.
Yeah, thank you. So my name is William, and I'm not actually an EDGAR database constructor, but I'm an EDGAR user. And in that context, I very much feel that EDGAR is necessary for the global stocktake of collective progress amongst other data sets. And the reasons are simple, right? So we need to know what current emissions are. We need to know what historical emissions are. As Giacomo mentioned in his presentation, we have these calculations of future pathways that get us to net zero and have different benchmarks of progress in 2030 and so on. So this comes from the scientific literature, but all of those calculations really start from current emissions as they are today. Current emissions are always changing, so we need to certainly keep an eye on what the current level is. But also, the fact is that in these scenarios, year after year, we're producing scenarios in the scientific community that show us pathways down to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. These scenarios assume that we are going to implement near-term mitigation action. As countries, as governments, and the global community fails to follow through with that and reduce emissions, then of course those scenarios have to be updated with the latest growth in emissions, so that we can come up with new projections and so forth. So this is really absolutely necessary that we have this up-to-date information on where we are with current emissions. And I would add that it's especially critical right now to have this information, and we need it as soon as possible, in fact. That's because the remaining global carbon budget is small, so we have a narrow window of opportunity to stay within the 1.5 degree budget, a slightly larger window for 2 degrees, but it's still challenging. And so study after study really shows that emissions trends this decade matter. So emissions trends this year, last year, and next year really, really matter. And it's also, of course, a matter of deep public interest. For example, what happened to emissions during COVID-19 a couple of years ago. So there's an element of urgency in having this information as well. Now, the problem is we don't actually get this information from non-Annex 1 national inventories. So countries are required to submit inventories to the UNFCCC, but at varying levels of stringency. So Annex 1 countries, we have the information, it's pretty up to date. But non-Annex 1 countries, for example, the last inventory we got officially from China was in 2014. The last inventory we got from India and Brazil were in 2016. And for many other countries, it's been even longer. So there's an extraordinary gap in our official understanding of where emissions are. And this problem, of course, gets worse as these countries are slowly increasing their share of global emissions. And as Simona mentioned, of course, some emissions and categories we don't even have official estimates for. So a global stocktake is actually not possible starting from the national inventories. And this is where EDGAR comes in. EDGAR fills that gap. It lets us track national global emissions with a relatively small delay. So T-1, that means EDGAR has published now emissions for 2021 last year. And so it really fills a critical role. I would say in the overall stocktake and the assessment of current progress. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Will. Will didn't introduce is among other things lead author of the UNEP-CAP report, which has been just presented here at the COP, and it's from the Mercator Research Institute on Global Commons and Climate Change. We'll then leave the floor to Martin Harold, section head of remote sensing and geoinformatics at Poznan, and he's an expert on the use of remote sensing. So the question to him is more to how to improve the land CO2 estimates based on health observation data.
Yeah, thank you. Also, thank you for the nice presentation, overview, and they clearly articulated the need that we need to do better in terms of data and information for the various issues that have been mentioned, and particularly the timeliness of information that we need to invest much more in than what we have at the table at the moment. And Earth observation, so mostly satellite-based, are actually part of this. They're providing increasing quality and detail, particularly for land use sector estimation assessments, for global monitoring and mapping, but also to support national greenhouse gas inventories, and also to support action on the ground. And since we are in Africa with the COP this year, it's actually very nice to see that over the last 10, 15 years, many African countries actually have improved their national capacities to use Earth observation data for their greenhouse gas inventories. So every country with significant share of forests in Africa, or willing to or actively participating in REDD+ and some of these mechanisms, are using already operationally Earth observation data as part of their inventories, and that's good to see. And then we know that these greenhouse gas inventories, these national data sources, are more reliable than have been before. And what's really appreciated is, besides the timeliness of information that can be provided by satellite data, is also the spatial detail. So you can only start to track activities, you can start to track land use activities, you can look at different land use types and different types of changes, forest changes, drivers of deforestation, all of that by using these spatially temporal and temporal detailed data. This is only possible because we have Earth observation programs like the European Commission's Copernicus program, which is providing free and open satellite data. And that is really the key, that these data are available to a large array of users. Because they're free and open, they enhance transparency, and they really support climate action through, for example, targeted planning, supporting implementation on the ground, for example, for any climate smart agriculture or climate smart forestry or any kind of land use sector climate actions. We do see also this field evolving quite a bit now in the field of the direct monitoring of forest biomass and carbon stocks through a combination of satellite measurements and measurements on the ground. So also these Earth observation programs are not exclusively satellite based. It's the integration, particularly when it comes to things like carbon stock and carbon stock changes. And this is the area where we actually really see the key opportunities to better estimate also the land carbon sink. Some of the big uncertainty we still have in the land use sector estimation that will help us to reconcile the gap we still have between national and global data, and provide more timely, more spatially explicit data also for climate action. So it's an interesting field of evolution. I think there's a strong European contribution, and it's also good to see that EDGAR is already a heavy user of Earth observation data and hopes to continue to be in the years to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. Very insightful overview. I would then pass the floor to Vicky Pollard, who is the acting head of unit at DG Climate Action for site economic analysis and modeling. For her is more a view from a policy side, what could be the relevance of EDGAR on global climate commitments and the support of the EU policies.
Thank you very much, Giacomo. And as the GAP report pointed out a few weeks ago, we're not on track to meeting the Paris Agreement targets, and we need transformational change. And as the speakers before me have emphasized, we need to know where we are now, and if and how the emissions trend is changing at global level, but also at national level, and in terms of what sectors are contributing to the greenhouse gas emissions, but also their removals. As mentioned by William, in the absence of inventories, regular reporting from non-Annex 1 parties, we have very much needed the information on developments of emissions globally, and EDGAR has been crucial for us in terms of understanding where we stand and communicating both at an international level on the need for action, for example, through our own Climate Action Progress Report, but also through the UN GAP report, And I think it's going to be really important as we feed into the global stocktake. I think in particular, the timeliness of the data, the investment made by the EDGAR team to have T-1 data. So for this year to have the 2021 data has been really important. It's been important at a time of great change. We've had the COVID pandemic. We have the war in Ukraine, and it's been very important to have more timely data as we in this period. And it's going to become increasingly important as we move forward. It's very important for us also in terms of communication with our EU stakeholders. We need to put our climate ambition in the EU into context, to explain the need for ambitious action in the EU. And we use, as I said before, the EDGAR data in our annual EU Climate Action Progress Report, which is our means of communicating on how we're doing with stakeholders, but also explaining where we stand in the broader context. For the EU, we have a target of reaching climate neutrality by 2050. It's set in our European climate law, along with the interim target of net domestic reduction of -55% in 2030. It's ambitious. It requires transformation of our economies. It requires actions from all sectors and from all of us. And for that, we need good data. Of course, in the EU, we have a well-established inventory, but it does help us to look at other data sources and to be able to cross-check the data and to keep improving it. It also helps that others can cross-check the inventory data. It increases confidence. As Giacomo has said, we're now focusing more and more on implementation. We need to make sure that this is working, and others need to be clear that this is working and have confidence in what we're doing. So it's about being able to establish new policies, implementation in those sectors which are harder to regulate, which are geographically more dispersed, going beyond easier to regulate point source emissions. And in particular, the work that's been done on land use, on agriculture, and on our food system is very important. And we're facing a lot of questions around that, but also around, for example, a wider range of greenhouse gases, methane leaks, and so on. So it's important for us that we get a good picture. It's important that we understand which policies work, which policies don't work, and that we are credible as decision makers, that people can hold decision makers accountable, but also as we become more and more ambitious, that people can see the impacts of their own choices. As we get closer to climate neutrality, not only are we looking at harder to abate sectors, but we're also looking at behavioral change. And so it's not just about the political support for ambitious targets, it's also about people seeing how their own choices, own investments, and lifestyle choices might affect the climate, and the sorts of disaggregated data that is being developed in work such as being done by EDGAR is tremendously important. So I just wanted to conclude that for me, I'm very pleased that this is a European Commission activity. It's great for us as DG Klima, as the policymakers, to have colleagues in the JRC, in our science arm, working on this and working with scientists across the world. It's an important investment, and I'm very happy to be able to come and talk about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vicky, for this overview, extremely useful. So we now pass the floor to the audience, and we see already a question I would start with. The question is based on LULUCF data now in EDGAR. Do you see implication taken in a major report like the International Energy Agency net zero report? I would tentatively maybe ask William to say something, and I can then for the comment and intervene, and then we have also other questions. So which would be the impact, also including LULUCF in the net zero report, like the one from the International Energy Agency?
Yeah, well, we know from the scenario literature on reducing emissions to net zero that sinks are very important, just as sources are. So we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but we also need to some extent, enhance removals, and that's because they're very difficult to mitigate sectors, for example, in industry and parts of agriculture. So I am not personally familiar with the details around the IEA net zero scenario, but I can certainly say that including land use emissions is a key component of such scenario exercises, and they are included in, for example, the IPCC range of scenarios. And most of those show that, for example, you need to scale up land use removals by a gigaton or two in the coming decades, up to 2050, in order to compensate for those expected residual emissions. So, including that sector is highly important.
Thank you very much. And just a few words on that. Of course, the EDGAR LULUCF component, as explained by Simone, try to mimic as much as possible with the tier one approach, so quite simple approach, the approach by country inventories on LULUCFs. Therefore, as a bigger sink for forest than what reported, for example, in IPCC. So when speaking of the net zero report, like IEA or the IPCC, the approach to LULUCF is somehow different. So this has to be taken into account, these differences when assessing scenarios. I do have another question I would ask mainly to Martin. Why we have different estimates from remote sensing, and which are the main challenge of using remote sensing for supporting the work here at the COP?
Yeah, no, thanks. And of course, I think an important point on why we do see difference in estimations is, I think, something you alluded to, Giacomo. I mean, we're still in a situation where in instances we're comparing apples and oranges. So we're measuring different parts of the land. We do have a bit different approaches in how we define things, and that can cause differences. And those are the differences we can resolve if we work together, basically, and understand where the estimates come from and can reduce these differences. And that's, I think, a process we are still in. For example, with Earth observation, we're looking at all the land. We initially don't necessarily care whether a land is managed or considered managed or not. What is the definition of a forest? In theory, we're seeing all trees, but of course, definitions are part of accounting rules and also have to be considered. So those are the typical differences that we see. And Earth observation data are relatively flexible to be adapted to different, definitional conditions and so on. But there's also differences that are really due to uncertainties, and that is really related to the land sink. So measuring the, let's say, slow uptake of carbon, of vegetation growth and soil carbon stocks increases, for example, from the atmosphere, that's the fluxes. We still have a hard time. Where with a good combination of on-the-ground and satellite measurements, we can, I think, make quite some progress in the years to come to get a better handle on that. And we also know that many of the greenhouse gas inventories, I would say particularly those outside of Europe, and they do have a still very weak approaches, I would say, to estimate the land sink. So, and I think that is where we have to put a particular effort together. It's a combination of approaches that will lead that, but if we can resolve that part, I think we are getting much, much closer to an agreement when not only to, let's say, agree globally and nationally, but also to agree on when we support enhancements of the land sink, for example, to putting more trees in landscapes or putting more carbon in soils or in wetlands and all of that. Those are important actions we have on the table that we also have to report progress on. And that's something for the years to come that will be a priority for the Earth observation community together with the implementing communities to tackle.
Okay, many thanks. We do have a few other questions. I have many questions, actually. One, I would tentatively suggest Vicky to reply, but also Simone and Monica online are welcome to intervene. So how in practice EDGAR can be used or is used in the context of the COP meetings? Would first ask Vicky, then maybe others may intervene.
Well, I think in practice, in terms of the COP meetings, it's the information behind how far we need to go. So where we stand now and how far we are from the trend we need to be on to get to the Paris Agreement objectives. So the data this year shows that we've had a large increase relative to 2020. Of course, there was the COVID dip in 2020, but still the trend is that the greenhouse gas emissions have been increasing. And so what the EDGAR data does is with other data sets is show we really need to take action, transformational action, to increase, implement existing commitments, and to put in place the necessary policies, but also to look again at our NDC commitments to make sure that we're on track. So globally, we need to increase action, and EDGAR helps maintain that pressure. And in the future, it's also a guarantee that the pledges can be traced, and we will be better able to assess progress towards the decisions being taken. So where people are coming forward with new NDC pledges, we know that we can trace them and we can look at the implications of the policies being put in place.
Thank you very much. We do have other questions, and I would also stay with you. Can developing countries reach higher living standards without increasing too much their emission? Of course, it's a policy difficult question, very much debated here about the developing countries and the emissions associated to their expected further development. I would start from Vicky, but the others are welcome to intervene.
For me, addressing greenhouse gas emissions and development and living standards go hand in hand. We're talking about important investments that help reduce greenhouse gas emissions, which also are important in terms of securing energy supply, in terms of lifestyle. And so I think that it's not a question of either or. I think it's definitely a question of both. And of course, we look at the EU, and of course, there we're talking about development country context. But it's clear that our GDP growth is decoupled from our greenhouse gas emissions. You know, we've reduced our greenhouse gas emissions by 32%, I think, last year relative to 1990 levels, and during that time, I think our GDP emissions, our GDP growth has been around 62%. So GDP growth is not dependent on emissions, and we now have technologies which are available, which have really decreased in price. For example, for renewables, where I think developing countries now can effectively take the steps to improve living standards without going through the polluting history of other developed and emerging economies to improve living standards.
Okay, thanks a lot. A question I would pass to Will, maybe something very much debated here at the COP. I wonder when, if and when we will acknowledge that the Paris Agreement target are no longer within reach. How would you address that, Will?
Yeah, so I think this refers to the remaining carbon budget associated with 1.5 degrees. Yeah, I think it might not be obvious when exactly we cross the threshold of having expended that carbon budget. I think what's more relevant is to make the point that even if we do cross that, and at some point we can measure that through Earth observations and a reassessment of the evidence there. If that does become clear, then I think we simply need to emphasize that, well, then we should head for getting to emissions, getting to net zero emissions, reducing greenhouse gases simply faster than we planned, with increased ambition. If we miss 1.5, then we should go for 1.6. If we miss that, we should go for 1.7. The impacts simply scale up at an increasingly dramatic rate as we cross these different thresholds. So I think take less focus perhaps on the threshold, more focus on reducing emissions, more focus on getting to zero is the right way to go there. Yes,
thank you. Now the new mantra on that issue is every fraction of degree matters. So don't need to focus, as you said, on a specific target. So a question I would pass to Monica, if possible. I would take another one or two questions, and then I would leave the last few minutes to Vicky Pollard to conclude. So the question is, when we say greenhouse gas emissions, are we really including all greenhouse gas emissions, or we're just actually talking about methane and CO2? I don't know if Monica and Simone want to say something.
Okay, global greenhouse gas emissions has developed within EDGAR cover fossil CO2, methane, N2O, and fluorinated gases. So we do cover actually all greenhouse gas emissions.
Yes, thank you. Well, other questions still would remain to Monica. It would be interesting to relay the emission for allocation with socioeconomic data for a given region, so the public could see the relationship between inequality and emissions. There are a couple of questions about inequality. So how would you address that, Monica, on the possibility to overlay the emission, especially explicit on with socioeconomic region, and analyze that in the context of possible inequality?
Yeah, sure. As we are seeing, there are quite some inequalities at the global level. We have shown that more than half of global greenhouse gas emissions is emitted only by top 6 emitting economies. Surely there are disparities. Regions within the top emitters are possibly not those seeing the most prominent climate change impacts as well. So there are inequalities that should be addressed also by, let's say, industrialized countries and emerging countries in order to ensure that these mitigation sections are taking place now, in order to have produced benefits not only for the global, greenhouse gas emission reduction, but actually to improve the situation of those countries which are already suffering now for climate change impacts. And so there are many stuff. Yeah.
Thank you very much. We have still a few more questions, but we cannot address them all. I would leave the last 2 minutes concluding remarks to Vicky Pollard to sum up this side event, which attracted a lot of questions and attention.
Thank you very much, Giacomo. And just to sum up, I think what we've seen in an hour, a presentation of a bit of the history of EDGAR, its use in terms of global emissions tracking. It shows the importance of having a worldwide, globally consistent data set, which is independent, which can be used to fill important data gaps, to allow people, governments, the world round to assess the need for action, both global ambition, but also national and more local ambition or sectoral activity. It shows the importance also of having timely data. And I think in particular in this time, this decade, but also this time as we're looking to the global stocktake next year, it's very important to be able to look at the trend, but also what's been happening most recently, to feed into the important discussions that will take place in terms of how we can all look to boost global ambition. I think it's also shown how important it is to have scientifically relevant sort of best practice, but looking using imaging data which has good geographic coverage. In particular, when we're looking at sectors such as land use, agriculture, systemic approaches such as the food system, where it's really important that we look both at emissions, but also at CO2 removals as we move towards climate neutrality. And from your questions, I can see quite a range of those issues are very important also for developing countries moving forwards. And I think there in particular, what's interesting is the use of tools such as EDGAR and the knowledge around it in terms of building capacity in developing countries in terms of the data availability, but also in terms of feeding into policy, development policy, as well as alongside climate policy. And just to say, of course, this is open source. It's very useful data. So just also to encourage you to keep watching what's happening under EDGAR and to make use of it. Thank you very much. And thanks to all the speakers and everybody online for the very good questions and discussion.
Thank you very much, Vicky. And with that, I would close this event. Thanks to Vicky, Elisabetta, the organizer, and of course, all the speakers and all those that follow this event and put forward a number of interesting and challenging questions. Thank you very much.